November 24, 1865, Willow Creek Plantation, 37 miles southwest of Charleston, South Carolina. The autumn breeze carried the scent of roasted turkey and sweet potato pie drifting from the main house. Yet in the quarters, a different hunger stirred. The war had concluded 7 months prior. Lincoln's proclamation had journeyed through telegraph lines and newspaper columns, but on this secluded stretch of Carolina land, everything remained unchanged. 342 souls still rose before dawn, still bent their backs in fields that would forever remain someone else's property, still watched their children sold away like livestock. When questioned about freedom, the master had simply laughed. He claimed those papers meant nothing this far from Washington, insisted his land operated under God's law, not Lincoln's. But on this Thanksgiving Day, while the white folk clinked crystal glasses and carved their third helpings of meat, a man called Josiah Webb stood in the doorway of cabin number 7 and made a choice that would cost him everything. He stood 6'9", tall with hands capable of snapping an axe handle, and a voice so deep it seemed to rise from the earth itself. For 43 years those hands had picked cotton, cleared timber, and constructed the very mansion where his owners now feasted. Yet tonight those hands would perform something they'd never attempted before. Tonight they would point toward freedom. Before we proceed with this astonishing narrative, subscribe to the channel and comment which city you're listening from. Let's strengthen our community collectively. Thank you. And now we resume the story. Josiah had deliberately selected Thanksgiving. He'd observed the pattern for years, counted the bourbon bottles disappearing from the cellar, timed exactly how long before the overseers stumbled toward their beds. By 900, the patrol dogs would be fed scraps from the feast, their bellies too full for running. By 10, the riders who normally circled the grounds would be passed out in the barn. The window would remain narrow, perhaps 4 hours before dawn, yet it would prove sufficient. He moved through the quarters like a shadow, pausing at each cabin door. His message remained consistent, delivered in a whisper that somehow carried absolute certainty. Bring nothing. Leave behind anyone who might slow us down. When you hear the whip-poor will call 3 times, walk to the oak tree by the tobacco barn. Don't run. Don't look back. And if anyone inquires where you're going, say you're checking the smokehouse. Some stared at him as though he'd lost his mind. Others grabbed his arm with trembling fingers. A few shut their doors in his face, too terrified even to listen. But by 1100 that night, 47 people gathered beneath that oak tree, their hearts pounding so loudly Josiah swore the sound would rouse the dead. The map in Josiah's mind had required 16 years to construct. He couldn't read or write, but he could observe. He knew sunrise arrived first over the eastern ridge, meaning north was to its left. He'd learned this from watching birds migrate, from tracking the North Star's position through the gaps in his cabin roof. He knew the hounds never patrolled the marshy ground near Black Creek, because their paws would sink into the mud. He discovered this after watching a tracker dog sink to its chest and require 3 men to pull it free. He knew which farms between here and the North Carolina border kept candles burning in their windows after midnight. Those weren't coincidences. Those were signals from Quaker families, from free black farmers, from people who'd quietly chosen to defy the law. He'd memorized each location, had tested his memory by closing his eyes and reciting their positions like a prayer. 32 miles northeast, the widow Patterson's dairy farm, white house with green shutters. 51 miles north, the Anderson Mill. Look for the water wheel that doesn't turn. 73 miles northwest, the railroad crossing where the tracks bend like an elbow. Wait in the hollow oak until a northbound train stops for water. Every detail had been collected in stolen glances, in conversations with traveling peddlers, in whispered exchanges with other enslaved people who'd heard stories from those who'd attempted escape. He'd waited 16 years because rushing meant dying, and dying meant leaving everyone else behind. The memory of how Josiah began constructing his mental map traces back to 1849, when he was 27 years old. A trader had come through selling supplies, a white man from Pennsylvania, who seemed different from the usual visitors. This man looked enslaved people in the eye while speaking. He asked their names. He treated them like human beings. Josiah had been loading grain sacks into the man's wagon when the trader leaned close and uttered something that transformed everything. The North Star's always in the same place. Find it and you'll never be lost. That was all. Just one sentence. Yet Josiah spent the subsequent 16 years watching that star, understanding its position relative to everything around him, constructing a navigation system in his head that no one could confiscate. He discovered moss grew thicker on the north side of trees. He discovered geese flew in a V formation pointing north when winter approached. He discovered certain flowers opened their petals toward the sun's arc, which moved from east to west. Nature became his teacher, and he became an obsessive student. Every trip to the mill, every journey to neighboring plantations to assist with harvest, every moment beyond Willow Creek's immediate confines became an opportunity to gather information. He'd count his steps between landmarks. He'd memorize the shape of hills against the sky. He'd eavesdrop on conversations between white men discussing roads and towns, filing away every useful detail. By 1865, he carried an atlas in his mind, more detailed than most maps drawn on paper. The system of coded messages in cotton sacks had begun almost accidentally. In the summer of 1864, Josiah had been working in the gin house when he'd noticed certain tear patterns in the burlap appeared almost intentional. He'd started experimenting, using a nail to scratch marks into fabric scraps, leaving them where other workers would find them. Initially, the messages were simple. A mark indicating which overseer would work which field the next day. A symbol warning that a slave catcher was visiting from a neighboring plantation. The system evolved slowly, carefully, with Josiah teaching trusted people how to interpret the marks and create their own. By Thanksgiving 1865, at least 30 people understood the language. They developed symbols for days of the week, for danger levels, for meeting locations. A circle with a line through it meant cancel the plan. 3 dots in a triangle meant urgent. A curved line like a river meant head toward the water. The system's brilliance lay in its invisibility. Overseers saw damaged cotton sacks and saw exactly what they expected to see, nothing more. They never imagined that the very crop enriching them carried messages of rebellion from picker to packer to transporter. The sacks moved through the plantation like a secret postal system, each one potentially carrying information that could save lives or launch an escape. Josiah had created a communications network inside a prison right under the noses of people who thought they controlled everything. 3 weeks before Thanksgiving, Josiah had made his first attempt with 12 people he'd spent months preparing. They'd departed on November 2nd, a Thursday night with no moon. The group included Samuel, a 19-year-old born on the plantation who'd never seen anything beyond its borders. Also, Martha and her 2 daughters, ages 14 and 16. Thomas, who worked in the stables and understood horses better than most white men. Elizabeth, who'd survived having 3 children sold away from her and had nothing left to lose. They'd made it 4 miles before disaster struck. The miscalculation had been simple but fatal. Josiah had planned the route to avoid the main patrol areas, but he hadn't known the master had recently hired 3 additional riders to cover the eastern boundary. These new men were hungry to prove themselves. eager to catch runaways and earn bonuses. They'd been patrolling a section Josiah thought was safe. The hounds picked up the scent near a creek crossing. The sound of those dogs baying in the darkness still haunted everyone who heard it, a sound that turned blood to ice water. The group had attempted hiding in a ravine, pressing themselves into the mud, covering their faces with leaves and branches. But dogs don't hunt by sight. By the time torches appeared through the trees, they all knew it was finished. Samuel had been the only one who fought. He'd grabbed a fallen branch and swung it at the first approaching rider, catching the man across the shoulder hard enough to knock him from his horse. For 5 seconds, Samuel had looked like he might actually escape. Then 3 more riders converged, and the rifle butts descended like hammers. They beat him until he stopped moving, left him bleeding in the dirt as an example. The master had assembled everyone the next morning in the plantation yard, forced them to stand in the November cold for 2 hours, while he explained what happened to slaves who forgot their place. Samuel's body remained displayed for 3 days before they permitted burial. Afterward, whispers circulated through the quarters that Josiah had gotten a boy killed, that attempting escape was suicide, that the smart choice was to wait and pray for things to change on their own. But Josiah had stood at Samuel's grave and perceived something different. He'd seen that Samuel had chosen how to die. That choice, that moment of self-determination, outweighed everything else. At the burial held secretly after dark, Josiah had spoken to the 11 who'd survived the attempt. His words were simple. If we stay here and do nothing, we all die anyway, just slower. We die in fragments, watching our children sold, watching our bodies break, watching our spirits crushed. At least Samuel died trying to be free. At least he died like a man, not property. None of them had argued. And when Thanksgiving arrived, all 11 stood under that oak tree, ready to try again. This time they brought others. This time the group was larger, more diverse, more determined. Martha brought her daughters again, their faces carrying the same hard resolve as their mother. Thomas brought his younger brother, a 15-year-old boy scheduled to be sold after Christmas. Elizabeth convinced 6 other women to join, women who'd lost so much they had nothing left to fear. The first attempt had been a test. The second attempt was a declaration of war. The 47 people gathering under the oak tree that Thanksgiving night represented nearly every work crew on the plantation. Field hands and house servants, blacksmiths and cooks, children and elders. The youngest was 6 years old, a girl called Mercy, whom her mother carried on her hip. The oldest was Benjamin, age 71, who'd lived his entire life enslaved and declared he'd rather die walking north than perish in a cotton field. Josiah looked at these faces and felt the weight of what he'd initiated. These weren't merely 47 people. These were 47 sets of hopes and fears, 47 reasons to succeed, 47 possible deaths on his conscience should things go wrong. But backing out now wasn't possible. They'd already taken the most dangerous step, which was deciding to try. From this moment forward, the only direction was forward. He delivered final instructions in a voice barely audible. We move in single file. No talking. If someone falls, the person behind helps them up. If dogs come, we split into 3 groups and meet at Black Creek. If captured, you don't know where the others went. You were just running blind. A woman named Sarah raised her hand like a child in school, and Josiah nodded toward her. What if they torture us for information? She asked. Josiah's expression hardened. Then you remember that protecting 46 other people is worth whatever they do to you. You remember you're not merely saving yourself, you're saving all of us. At 11:14 p.m., the Wickpoor will called 3 times. The calls came from Thomas, who could imitate bird sounds so perfectly that even other birds answered him. and 47 people started walking toward freedom. The route Josiah had planned directed them northeast for the first 5 miles, following a dry creek bed that offered cover and muffled their footsteps. The November night was cold enough to see breath, but not cold enough for frost. That was crucial. Frost would create noise walking through grass. The creek bed wound through pine forest thick enough to block moonlight, which meant traveling mostly by touch and memory. Josiah led from the front, counting steps, pausing every few minutes to listen for pursuit sounds. Behind him, 46 people moved like ghosts, holding hands in the darkness to stay connected. Children had been warned to maintain silence regardless, and to their credit, they obeyed. Even Mercy, the 6-year-old, produced no sound beyond soft breathing. The first hour passed without incident. They covered approximately 2 miles, slower than Josiah had hoped, but faster than he'd feared. At the 1-hour mark, they paused in a clearing where the creek bed widened. Josiah moved through the group, checking faces, whispering encouragement. An old man named Benjamin was already breathing heavily, but he waved off help offers with stubborn pride. Martha's daughters looked terrified, yet determined, holding hands so tightly their knuckles showed white even in darkness. Thomas kept glancing back the way they'd come, his body tense as a drawn bowstring, listening for dogs. Everyone understood the next few hours would determine whether they lived or died free. At the 2-hour mark, they reached Black Creek, the narrow, fast, moving stream that would either save them or destroy them. This represented the moment Josiah had been planning for, the crucial point where they'd eliminate their scent trail and make pursuit nearly impossible. Yet gazing at the dark water rushing past, hearing how fast it moved, he felt doubt for the first time since they'd started. The creek was running higher than anticipated. November rains had swollen it beyond its normal banks. What should have been thigh-deep crossing now appeared closer to chest, deep with currents strong enough to sweep away anyone losing their footing. He turned to face the group, and in the faint starlight, he could perceive the fear in their eyes. They'd trusted him to deliver them to safety, and now he was asking them to wade into water that could drown them. An elderly woman named Grace spoke up, her voice quavering yet firm. "I can't swim. Never learned." At least 20 other voices murmured agreement. Josiah had known this would be problematic, had tried to plan for it, yet seeing it in reality made the danger concrete. "We lock arms," he said, demonstrating by grabbing Thomas's arm and having Thomas grab the next person's. "We form a chain. Strong people on the outside, children and elders in the middle. We move slowly. If someone loses footing, the whole chain stops until they're steady. Understand?" Heads nodded in darkness. "And one more thing," Josiah added. "The water's going to be cold, colder than you anticipate. Your body will want to gasp and panic. Don't breathe slowly. Keep moving. The cold can't kill you in the time required to cross, but the current can if you fight it instead of working with it." He omitted mentioning that cold water could absolutely kill them if they remained in it too long. That hypothermia would develop within minutes. No point adding that fear to everything else they already carried. Josiah entered the water first, feeling the cold shock hit him like a physical assault. The creek bottom was rocky and uneven with slippery moss covering most surfaces. He planted his feet carefully, using his size and strength to anchor himself against the current. Thomas followed, then Benjamin, then a woman named Rachel, who'd worked in the fields her entire life and possessed arms strong as iron. They formed the corners of a human chain with the most vulnerable people in the center. Mercy, the 6-year-old, was carried by her mother Clara, who held the girl high against her chest with both arms. The chain began moving into the creek. 47 people connected by grip and trust, stepping into black water that rushed past with sinister speed. The crossing should have taken 10 minutes. It required 30. Every step demanded negotiation with the current, with the rocks underfoot, with the creeping cold that numbed fingers and weighted legs. Halfway across, an old man stumbled and nearly brought down 6 people with him. The chain held, 3/4 across. A young woman began hyperventilating from the cold, her breath coming in rapid gasps threatening to become screams. The person beside her whispered urgently, talking her through it, keeping her moving. And then, with the far bank less than 10 feet away, disaster struck. A small girl near the middle of the chain, 8-year-old Hannah, lost her grip on the woman adjacent to her. One moment she was there, the next she'd slipped beneath the surface with barely a splash. Her father, Jacob, lunged for her and lost his own footing in the process. The chain broke. People scattered, some falling into the water, others scrambling toward the bank. Josiah witnessed it, all unfolding in nightmare slow motion. He released his position and dove toward where Hannah had submerged, his massive body cutting through the current like a ship's prow. The water was black as ink, and he couldn't see anything beneath the surface. He reached down, sweeping his arms in wide arcs, feeling nothing but water and rocks. His lungs began burning. He stayed under, kept searching, knowing every second meant life or death. His hand brushed fabric. He grabbed it, pulled hard, and surged upward with Hannah clutched against his chest. She wasn't breathing. He made it to the bank and laid her on the rocks, tilting her head back and pressing on her chest the way he'd witnessed a doctor do once years ago, when a slave had nearly drowned in a mill pond. Water poured from Hannah's mouth. She coughed, gasped, and started crying. The sound of her crying was the most beautiful thing Josiah had ever heard. Yet, as people pulled themselves onto the far bank, shivering violently and checking each other for injuries, Josiah realized something was missing. He reached for his belt for the leather pouch he'd kept tied there with cord length. The pouch containing the cloth map he'd spent months creating, carefully marking every landmark and safe house with berry juice ink on a piece of stolen linen. The pouch was gone, torn away by the current during his dive to rescue Hannah. The map he'd relied upon, the backup plan for when memory failed, had disappeared into Black Creek. For several seconds, Josiah stood frozen, his mind racing through the implications. Without the map, they were dependent entirely on his memory, and memory could fail. He could forget a turn, misremember a distance, lead them in circles. Yet the 46 faces looking at him expected confidence, expected leadership, expected him to possess answers. So he suppressed the panic and focused on immediate concerns. We need to move. The cold will set in if we remain still. Let's distance ourselves from the water and find somewhere to rest until dawn. No one needed to know about the lost map. Not yet. Perhaps never. They discovered shelter in a dense laurel thicket about half a mile from the creek. A natural hollow providing concealment and slight wind protection. Everyone huddled together for warmth, their clothing soaked and bodies shaking from cold and adrenaline. This was intended as a brief rest, maybe 30 minutes to recover from the crossing, yet exhaustion struck hard. Children fell asleep immediately, their small bodies trusting adult protection. Even in these desperate circumstances, some adults dozed despite the cold, their bodies demanding rest after 2 hours of tension and fear. Josiah remained awake, his mind working through calculations. They'd covered approximately 3 miles in 2 hours. At that pace, reaching the North Carolina border would require 50 hours, and they didn't have 50 hours. By dawn, the plantation would discover their absence. By mid-morning, search parties would assemble. By afternoon, Professional slave catchers would be summoned with their dogs and horses and experience. The calculation was simple and brutal. Unless they moved faster, they'd be caught. Yet they couldn't move faster. Not with children and elders, not through rough terrain and darkness. The contradiction had no solution. Or rather, it had one solution, the one Josiah couldn't bring himself to consider. They could divide the group, send the youngest and fastest ahead, while slower ones drew pursuit. More people might escape that way, yet it would also mean deliberately sacrificing some to save others. And Josiah's mind recoiled from that calculation. Dawn arrived at 6:42 a.m. on November 25th, bringing both hope and danger. Hope because they could finally see where they were going, could move faster without risking injury in darkness. Danger because visibility worked both ways, and anyone hunting them would have an easier time spotting their trail. Josiah made a decision. We continue moving through daylight. We can't afford hiding and waiting for nightfall. The plantation has already discovered our absence. Every hour we waste is an hour they gain. The group emerged from the laurel thicket and continued northeast, following a path staying parallel to Black Creek, yet sufficiently far from the water to avoid main roads. The morning brought another challenge: hunger. No one had eaten since the previous day, and children were beginning to complain. Josiah had known food would be problematic, yet he'd gambled they could reach the first safe house before supplies became critical. Now, with the lost map and slower than expected pace, that gamble appeared increasingly foolish. Around 9 in the morning, Thomas spotted a persimmon tree heavy with fruit. The group stopped and people filled their pockets with persimmons, eating some immediately and saving others for later. It wasn't much, yet it was something. The brief food stop also allowed Josiah to check everyone's condition. Most were holding up better than anticipated, though Benjamin's breathing was labored and concerning. Martha's daughters had blisters forming on their heels from walking in wet shoes. Mercy had developed a cough sounding serious, yet no one complained. No one requested turning back. The spirit sustaining them this far remained strong. At 10:15 a.m., they heard the first pursuit sounds, dogs barking distantly back toward the direction they'd come from. The sound was faint, yet unmistakable, and it sent terror jolting through the entire group. Josiah's mind raced. The dogs shouldn't have picked up their trail this quickly. The water crossing should have eliminated their scent. Unless the slave catchers employed a different strategy, starting their search at Black Creek itself, because it was the obvious destination for runaways. If that were the case, the dogs were tracking their creek exit, following the wet footprints they'd left on rocks and vegetation. And wet tracks were easy to follow. Run, Josiah said, the word cutting through morning air like a whip crack. Not all out, yet as fast as you can manage. We need distance. The group broke into a shuffling run. Children carried by adults. Elders pushing themselves beyond what their bodies should have been capable of. They covered the next 2 miles in 25 minutes. A pace unsustainable, yet possibly buying them time. At the end of those 2 miles, Josiah called another stop in a ravine where steep sides would muffle sound. Everyone collapsed, gasping for breath, legs trembling. Thomas looked at Josiah with wild eyes. They're going to catch us. There are too many of us moving too slowly. We can't outrun dogs and horses. Josiah grabbed Thomas by the shoulders. We're not going to outrun them. We're going to outlast them. Those dogs have been tracking since dawn. They'll get tired. Horses can't run full speed through this terrain. The men chasing us will make mistakes because they're angry and overconfident. We simply need to keep moving, keep making smart choices and stay together. Yet staying together was about to become impossible. At 11:30 a.m., cresting a small rise, They spotted the riders. 9 men on horseback approximately half a mile behind them, moving at a steady trot. The riders hadn't spotted them yet. They were following the trail rather than pursuing by sight. Yet it was only a matter of time. Josiah made a decision contradicting every instinct he possessed. We split into 3 groups. Thomas, take 15 people and head due north through heavy woods. Martha, take 15 and go northeast following the river bottom. I'll take the rest and go northwest toward higher ground. We meet at the Anderson Mill, the one with the water wheel that doesn't turn, 51 miles north of Willow Creek. If someone doesn't make it, the others keep going. Understood. The group split with agonizing speed, people grabbing children and making impossible choices about who to stay with and who to separate from. Families divided, friends parted. In 90 seconds, 3 groups of roughly equal size were heading in different directions, and Josiah was leading 16 people up a rocky slope toward a ridgeline he hoped would offer cover. Behind them, dog barking grew louder. The slave catchers had reached the point where the group divided and were now making their own decisions about which trail to pursue. Josiah's group reached the ridge and dropped down the far side, using boulder clusters to mask their passage. He risked a backward glance and observed that 5 of the 9 riders had followed Thomas's group north. 2 riders pursued Martha's group, and 2 riders were coming directly toward Josiah's position. The splitting decision had worked, at least partially, yet it also meant Josiah had no idea whether the other 2 groups would survive. He'd saved some by potentially sacrificing others, and that choice's weight settled on his shoulders like iron chains. The 2 riders following Josiah's group proved persistent. For the next 2 hours, they played a brutal cat-and-mouse game through increasingly rough terrain. Josiah's group would scramble up a hillside, slide down the far side, cross a stream, climb another rise. The riders would appear minutes later, their horses picking through obstacles, yet always maintaining pressure. The group with Josiah included Benjamin, the 71-year-old, whose breathing had been concerning since dawn. It also included Clara and her daughter Mercy, the 6-year-old who'd survived the creek crossing yet developed a worsening cough. And it included Ruth and her 8-year-old son Daniel, the boy feverish the night before, and only worsening during the day's exertion. They were by any measure the slowest and most vulnerable of the 47 who'd commenced this journey, which was precisely why Josiah had kept them with him. He couldn't outrun the riders with this group. Yet perhaps he could outlast them through terrain their horses couldn't manage. He led them into an area of steep ravines and dense undergrowth, places where horses would break legs if riders pushed too hard. The strategy worked temporarily. The riders had to dismount and lead their horses, slowing them to nearly the same pace as the runaways, yet it couldn't work indefinitely. Horses could carry supplies. Horses didn't tire like humans. Horses meant their riders could rest while covering ground. At 2 p.m. on November 25th, Benjamin collapsed, simply stopped walking and sat down heavily on a fallen log, his chest heaving, his lips tinged blue. Josiah knelt beside him and immediately recognized the old man was finished. Not giving up, yet physically incapable of proceeding. Benjamin grabbed Josiah's wrist with surprising strength. "Leave me? I slow you down and I'm finished anyway. Leave me and save the children." Josiah shook his head. "I'm not abandoning anyone." Benjamin's expression hardened. "Then you're killing everyone. Those riders are approaching, and every minute you waste on me is a minute they gain. You want my death to hold meaning? Then leave me here and run." The terrible logic of it cut through Josiah like a blade. Benjamin was correct. Staying meant everyone would be caught. Leaving meant some might escape. Yet leaving also meant abandoning the core principle, initiating this entire attempt. The idea that everyone mattered, that no one was disposable. Josiah looked at the 15 other faces observing this exchange, saw them waiting for his decision. Ruth spoke up, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "He's right, Josiah. We leave him. He gets his choice about how this ends, and we receive our chance to keep running." Benjamin nodded. "Tell them I fought. Tell I didn't go easily." Josiah felt something fracture inside himself, yet suppressed it. "We'll tell them you were free. That's what matters." He stood, took one final look at Benjamin sitting on that log in afternoon sunlight, and led the remaining 15 people deeper into forest. Behind them, they heard the riders reaching Benjamin's position, heard angry voices when the old man refused revealing which direction others had gone, heard whip sounds, then a gunshot, then silence. They continued walking. By 4:00 p.m., Josiah's group had covered another 3 miles, yet the cost was becoming unbearable. Daniel, Ruth's feverish son, was barely conscious, his mother carrying him on her back with rope tied around her waist, supporting his weight. Mercy coughed so hard she was bringing up blood. Clara carried her without complaint, yet the woman's face revealed strain. They were moving slower than walking pace now, stumbling through seemingly endless forest. And behind them, though the riders had stopped dealing with Benjamin, they'd eventually continue pursuit. Josiah knew they required shelter, needed rest, needed food and water, and medical help impossible to obtain. His mental map indicated the widow Patterson's farm was approximately 28 miles northeast of their current position. Might as well be on the moon. They'd never reach it at this pace, not with sick children and exhausted adults. The situation was impossible. Yet impossible was all they had, so they kept moving. At 4:30 p.m., they stumbled onto a dirt road. Josiah's initial instinct was retreating back into forest. Yet before they could, a wagon appeared around a road bend. A white man driving, a middle-aged farmer by appearance, hauling corn load. Josiah and his group froze, caught exposed with no cover, no excuse, no hope. This was it. This was where they'd be reported, captured, returned to Willow Creek to face whatever horrors the master had prepared for runaways. The farmer halted his wagon and stared at them for a long moment. Josiah stared back, his mind working through scenarios. Could they overpower the man? Could they flee before he raised alarm? The farmer examined the group, the exhausted faces, the children being carried, Ruth with Daniel tied to her back. He looked at Josiah and posed a single question. "You folks running north?" Josiah considered lying, considered dozens of different answers, and settled on truth because lies required energy he no longer possessed. "Yes." The farmer nodded slowly. "My name's William Carter. I've got a barn about 2 miles west of here. Got a cellar underneath where you can hide for a few days until the search moves on. Got food and clean water and medicine for sick children. Got a wife who'll ask no questions and tell no lies to anyone coming looking." Josiah felt tears beginning to form and forced them back. "Why?" he asked. William Carter's expression revealed no emotion whatsoever. "Because it's wrong keeping people as property. I recognized it was wrong before the war, and I recognize it's wrong now. I can't fix the entire system, yet I can help 16 people who need it. Now, do you want to stand here discussing philosophy, or do you want to leave this road before someone else arrives who'll shoot you on sight?" The barn was exactly 2 miles west, down a narrow track winding through farmland, clearly seeing better days. William Carter's property displayed war impact signs, fields partially left, fences needing repair, buildings weathered and worn. Yet the barn was solid, and more importantly, it had a cellar accessed through a trap door, hidden under hay bales. The cellar was perhaps 12 feet square, with dirt floor and rough stone walls. It was damp and dark and smelled of earth and old vegetables. It was the most beautiful place Josiah had ever seen. William Carter's wife, Margaret, appeared with blankets and food within minutes. She examined Daniel and Mercy, the two sick children, and sprang into action with the efficiency of someone experienced with illness. She brought willow bark tea for fever, honey for cough, clean cloths, and warm water. She worked quietly while William stood guard above, watching the road for search signs. By 6 p.m., all 16 people were concealed in the cellar, fed, warm, and for the first time in 30 hours, relatively safe. Josiah sat against the stone wall and felt exhaustion strike him like a physical weight. They'd made it, not to freedom, not north, yet to a breathing space moment, a moment when no one pursued them. A moment when sick children received care and exhausted adults could rest. It was temporary, yet temporary was sufficient. William Carter descended to the cellar after dark with news. The riders were still searching the area, asking questions at farms and threatening anyone suspected of helping runaways. 2 other escaped slave groups had been caught that afternoon, brought back in chains. Thomas's group and Martha's group. 31 people captured, beaten, returned to Willow Creek. Only Josiah's 16 remained free. And only because they'd stumbled onto the one road where the one man willing to help happened to be driving his wagon. At precisely the right moment, the margin between success and failure had been that narrow. Josiah felt those 31 recaptures weight like a physical blow. Thomas, who'd remained loyal from the beginning. Martha and her daughters who'd tried twice. All the others trusting him, risking everything, now back in chains, facing unimaginable punishment. And Benjamin dead in forest, his sacrifice purchasing perhaps an hour of lead time, ultimately making the difference. William Carter observed Josiah's expression and spoke quietly. You can't carry all of it. Some people got caught. Some people escaped. You did what you could with what you had. Now the question is what you do next. Josiah examined the 15 people sleeping in the cellar. At Ruth with Daniel, at Clara holding Mercy, at all the others who'd somehow survived. We continue moving. As soon as it's safe, we make it north and we tell people what happened here. We ensure everyone knows what Benjamin did, what Thomas and Martha did. We ensure this holds meaning. They remained in William Carter's cellar for 3 days. 3 days while slave catchers combed the area, while dogs sniffed at barn doors, while riders questioned every farmer within 10 miles. 3 days while Daniel's fever broke and Mercy's cough improved, and exhausted bodies recovered sufficient strength to continue. William Carter brought them food twice daily, brought search news, brought confirmation that other groups had been captured, and returned to Willow Creek. On the evening of the 3rd, November 28th, William descended to the cellar with different news. The search had moved south, following false reports of runaways, heading toward Georgia. The immediate area was clear, at least momentarily. It was time to move. William had used the 3 days preparing. He'd obtained false travel papers, claiming Josiah's group were freed slaves moving north for family reunification. The papers wouldn't withstand serious scrutiny, yet might deceive a casual patrol. He'd packed weeks' food, drawn a detailed map showing safe houses and friendly contacts between here and the North Carolina border. He'd even arranged wagon transport for the first 20 miles driven by a free black farmer owing William a favor. After that, you're on your own, William said. Yet you'll be 45 miles from Willow Creek, and the search has largely abandoned. You'll possess a genuine chance. At midnight on November 28th, 16 people climbed from the cellar into a cold, clear night. They loaded into the wagon, covering themselves with burlap sacks, and began rolling north. Josiah glanced back once at William Carter standing in his farmyard, this white man risking everything to assist strangers, and raised his hand in silent thanks. William nodded and vanished into his barn. The wagon ride required 4 hours, covering ground that would have taken 2 days on foot. At 4 a.m., they halted at a crossroads and the driver pointed north. Another 20 miles that way, you'll discover a church with a red door. Knock 3 times. Wait. Knock twice. Tell them William sent you. They'll help you reach the next stop. The driver departed without another word, and Josiah's group began walking again, following stars they'd learned to interpret, trusting in a network of strangers who determined human freedom outweighed human law. They walked for 5 more days, moving from safe house to church to sympathetic farm. The group diminished as they progressed. 3 people decided remaining in North Carolina, settling with families offering work and new names. 2 others split off heading west toward Tennessee, where they had relatives. By the time Josiah's group crossed into Virginia on December 4, 1865, only 11 of the original 47 remained. 11 out of 47 who'd started. That was the calculation. That was the price. That was both failure and success measured in human lives. Yet the story didn't conclude at the Virginia border. The 11 who made it north didn't simply vanish into new lives, forgetting what had occurred. Ruth, carrying Daniel, who'd survived his fever, settled in Richmond and established a boarding house, specifically for black families traveling north. She maintained a candle in her window every night, exactly like the signals Josiah had taught them to watch for. Thomas, captured and returned to Willow Creek, escaped again 6 months later and reached Philadelphia. He became a railroad porter and spent 30 years assisting people navigating routes north, transmitting the knowledge Josiah had shared. Clara and Mercy relocated to Washington, D.C., where Clara worked as a seamstress and secretly used her business to channel money to escaped slaves. She never publicly discussed Thanksgiving 1865, yet her children understood and her grandchildren understood, and they carried forward the comprehension that freedom required sacrifice. Each of the 11 became a network node spreading the same message Josiah had whispered in cabin doorways on that November night. Freedom is possible. Resistance is possible. You're not alone. The network grew organically, not through formal organization, yet through individual choices made by people who'd experienced both the cost and the necessity of fighting back. The captured ones' fate proved harder to trace. Most Willow Creek Plantation historical records were destroyed in an 1879 fire, deliberately set by the last master's son, attempting to conceal debt and fraud evidence. What little survived suggested at least 15 of the 31 captured runaways were sold to plantations further south within weeks of recapture. This was common practice, breaking up groups to prevent future escape attempts and recouping search costs. Martha and her daughters were among those sold, disappearing into post-war Southern agriculture's chaos. Their fate remains unknown. Thomas, as mentioned, escaped again and survived. Yet at least 6 people died from injuries sustained during recapture or subsequent punishment. The Willow Creek master apparently decided Mercy would encourage future attempts. So he made examples. Public whippings leaving permanent scars, family member sales as punishment, food and movement restrictions amounting to slow death. The cruelty was designed to break spirits, to terrorize people so completely about escape attempts they'd police each other, would betray anyone planning resistance. It worked on some, yet not everyone. Even facing horrific consequences, whispers persisted, plans developed. Small defiance acts accumulated, the spirit Josiah had kindled with his capture. On November 27, 1865, 3 days after the escape attempt, Josiah Webb was executed at Willow Creek Plantation. The master had wanted to wait, wanted to prolong punishment, create an extended example. Yet federal troops had been spotted in the area, and the last thing the master wanted was Union soldiers questioning why a supposedly freed slave remained in chains. So the execution was rushed, performed quickly before the remaining enslaved people who hadn't fled or been sold. They constructed a platform before the quarters, the same platform used for auctions before the war. They placed a noose around Josiah's neck, and they offered him speaking opportunity, perhaps hoping he'd beg for life, hoping he'd grant them the satisfaction of watching him break. Instead, Josiah looked out at faces he'd known for 43 years and spoke calmly. "Write their names. Everyone who ran with me, write their names down so someone remembers they attempted. So someone remembers we fought." The master laughed. Claimed slaves' names didn't matter, claimed no one would remember any of this. Yet Josiah continued speaking. "I lived free for 7 hours. That's 7 hours more than you'll ever possess, because you're enslaved to your own hatred. And that kind of slavery doesn't end with death. You'll remain in chains until your dying day, and you don't even recognize it." The word struck harder than any physical blow. The master's face drained white with rage, and he ordered immediate execution. They pulled the lever at 3:47 p.m. Josiah Webb died with eyes open, looking north toward where his people had run toward the freedom he'd attempted to give them, toward the future he believed possible, even though he wouldn't witness it. The immediate aftermath of Josiah's execution created ripples spreading far beyond Willow Creek. A traveling minister, a white Pennsylvania man named Reverend James Blackwell, had been passing through and witnessed the execution. He wasn't there accidentally. He'd heard escape attempt rumors and had come investigating, hoping to document post-war Southern conditions. What he witnessed disturbed him deeply enough to prompt action. Reverend Blackwell documented everything witnessed, interviewed people secretly, gathered information. Upon returning north, he published a pamphlet titled, "The Cost of Freedoms: One Man's Stand at Willow Creek." The pamphlet ran 32 pages, providing detailed accounts of the escape attempt, recapture, and execution. It portrayed Josiah not as criminal or troublemaker, yet as a freedom fighter whose courage matched any soldier dying in war. The pamphlet circulated through abolitionist networks, through churches, through reading rooms where people still cared about formerly enslaved people's fate. It reached perhaps 2,000 readers in its first printing. Yet those 2,000 readers included teachers heading south to establish schools, former Union soldiers working with the Freedmen's Bureau, journalists documenting Reconstruction. The story spread, mutated, expanded. Within a year, references to the Willow Creek martyrs appeared in speeches and editorials. By 1867, the story had become legendary, with details added and subtracted according to who told it. Yet the core remained. A man had attempted freeing enslaved people after the war supposedly already freed them, and he'd been executed for it. That fact, more than any editorial or speech, conveyed everything people needed to know about remaining work. The question whether Josiah's plan ever possessed realistic success chance-haunted everyone studying the event. 47 people moving through hostile territory with no resources, limited knowledge, active pursuit. The odds approached zero. Yet that analysis misses what actually occurred. Of the 47 starting, 11 reached freedom. That's 23% success. In baseball, that would be a terrible batting average. In war, it would be labeled tactical disaster. Yet these weren't soldiers playing games. These were people without options attempting the only remaining choice. 23% meant 11 formerly enslaved people were now free. 23% meant 11 people capable of assisting others, teaching others, inspiring others. 23% meant 11 small lights in darkness, each capable of igniting other lights. Judged by, did everyone make it? Standards. The attempt was failure. Judged by, did nothing change? Standards. The attempt was catastrophic success because things absolutely changed. Participants learned resistance was possible. Those hearing about it learned fighting back was an option. The safe house network strengthened as people like William Carter stepped forward. The Underground Railroad, supposedly ending with emancipation, actually gained new energy during Reconstruction chaos as people realized legal freedom wasn't identical to actual freedom. Back at Willow Creek, life continued its grinding pattern for those remaining. The plantation limped through 1866 and 1867, unable adapting to free labor, unable competing with farms modernizing during war. By 1868, the master had sold most land to pay debts. By 1869, the plantation was bankrupt. Remaining workers scattered to other farms or cities seeking wage work. The master died in 1871, bitter and broke, blaming war and slaves and government and everyone except himself. His children sold remaining property and moved west. The mansion, once wealth and power symbol, burned in 1879 in a fire whose cause was never determined. Some claimed lightning. Some claimed accident. Some claimed deliberate arson by someone enslaved, their wanting to erase their suffering's physical reminder. No one investigated thoroughly. By 1880, nothing remained of Willow Creek Plantation except foundation stones and a cemetery where the white family was buried. The quarters where 342 enslaved people had lived, the fields where they'd worked, the lives they'd lived, all vanished as if never existing. Yet memory persisted in ways buildings couldn't. The 11 who made it north carried stories they told their children, who told their children, who told theirs. Stories changed over time, as all stories do. Details blurred, names forgotten or altered, events compressed or expanded. Yet the core remained. A man named Josiah Webb had decided Thanksgiving 1865 would be the day freedom stopped being promise and started becoming reality. He'd planned escape. He'd gathered 47 people. He'd led them into night toward uncertain future. He'd been caught and executed. And in doing so, he'd created something outlasting his life. He'd created an example, a reference point, a story declaring trying was better than submitting, that dying free was better than living enslaved, that individual action mattered even against impossible odds. That story became family history for dozens of families descended from those 11 survivors. It became church tradition in black congregations across the South, told every Thanksgiving as reminder what the holiday meant to people with no reason for gratitude under slavery. It became legend, myth, inspiration. In 1963, a Boston Freedom Rider stood before a Charleston church and told the Josiah Webb story to explain why he'd come south, why he was willing facing violence and arrest. If a man in 1865 was willing dying for freedom, he said, how can I do less in 1963 when law supports me? That connection, that resistance lineage spanning a century, validated everything Josiah had accomplished. The Willow Creek Plantation site is now farmland. Row after soybean row stretching to horizon, worked by combines and irrigation systems, looking nothing like 1865. The mansion's foundation stones were cleared decades ago. The cemetery was repeatedly vandalized and finally paved over for access road. No historical marker, no plaque, no indication anything significant ever occurred here. In 1998, a local historical society petitioned placing a marker acknowledging plantation history and the 1865 escape attempt. The landowner, a corporate farming operation, refused permission. Claimed they didn't want controversy affecting property values. Claimed it was all ancient history anyway. Claimed no one cared about events over a century past. They were mistaken about that last part. People did care. In 2003, a descendant and activist coalition organized an annual memorial service on the public road bordering property. They gather every Thanksgiving morning at dawn when Josiah and 47 others began their northward walk. They read names of enslaved people who lived and died in the area. They sing hymns. They tell the story. The tradition has continued for over 20 years now, growing larger annually, attracting people from across the country who come remembering and honoring people whose names appear in no official records. The question of Josiah's body location after execution remains partially unresolved. Records indicate burial somewhere on Willow Creek property, yet no marker was placed and location was lost during multiple plantation ownership changes. In the 1990s, archaeologists conducted a survey of the old plantation site, preparing for development. They discovered a burial ground near the former quarters location containing approximately 60 individual remains, all consistent with enslaved people. One skeleton immediately distinguished itself. The individual would have stood between 68 and 7 feet tall at death, with bone structure suggesting tremendous physical strength and lifetime of hard labor. Skeletal analysis indicated hanging death with characteristic cervical vertebrae damage, consistent with judicial execution. The bones showed multiple healed fracture evidence, old whipping scars, and childhood malnutrition, followed by better nutrition in adulthood. Everything matched expectations for an enslaved person living entire life in bondage. The skeleton was designated Individual 23 in the archaeological report. DNA analysis was attempted yet produced no database matches. Without documentary evidence or genetic confirmation, the skeleton's identity couldn't be proven. Yet probability suggests it's Josiah Webb. The height alone makes it likely. The death manner makes it almost certain. In 2002, all site remains were re-interred with full ceremony at a memorial cemetery established specifically for slavery victims. Individual 23 received a marker reading. Unknown individual, possibly Josiah Webb, died circa 1865 fighting for freedom. Your name may be lost, yet your courage is remembered. Today, more than 150 years after that Thanksgiving night, Josiah Webb's story continues resonating. It appears in academic studies of Reconstruction-era resistance. It appears in genealogical research as descendants trace family trees back to Willow Creek. It's taught in some schools as part of Black history curriculum, though often simplified, missing the complexity and tragedy of actual events. The story has been adapted into plays, poems, and songs. A novelist wrote a fictionalized version in 2015, becoming a modest bestseller. A documentary filmmaker spent 3 years tracking down 11 survivor descendants, compiling their family stories into a film premiering at Sundance. The story refuses dying because it addresses something fundamental about human nature. Freedom's desire isn't abstract. It's not theoretical. It's concrete and immediate and worth dying for. Josiah understood this, transcending 1865's specific circumstances. He understood people need trying, need fighting, need resisting even when resistance seems futile, because surrender guarantees defeat, while trying at least creates change possibility. That lesson applies to slavery in 1865. It applies to segregation in 1965. It applies to every injustice and oppression form humans create. The details change, the uniforms change, the laws change, yet the fundamental question remains identical. Will you submit or will you fight? Josiah answered that question with his life, and his answer echoes across generations.